What do we know about Ishmael from the Bible? Ishmael was Abraham's first child. He was born when Abraham was 86 and lived near Hebron. In Genesis, God appeared to Abraham and promised him that he would have a child and become the father of many nations. But at that time, Sarah, Abraham's wife, couldn't have children. They were wondering how this promise would come true. Today, we'll be exploring the story of Ishmael, the sometimes forgotten son. This story is full of human struggles, divine promises, and God's unchanging grace. If you're inspired by stories of faith, heritage, and redemption, get ready for a deep dive into the details of Ishmael's story. Subscribe to Bible Stories to see more content like this. So about this story in Genesis, chapter 3, verse Sarah, who was still called Sarai, offered to Abraham, who at that time was famous like in Egypt, to serve Hagar as her wife. Sarai gave Hagar, her maid, to Abraham as his wife after they had lived in Canaan for 10 years. This kind of arrangement was a common custom at the time, like it was also practiced by Jacob's wives, where the wife provided a servant for her husband, and in many cases, all children were born from these unions and were considered legitimate. In this context, childless women usually offered their servants to produce descendants. Although this decision seemed practical to Abraham and Sarai, it led to some conflicts. Hagar actually conceived Abraham's child, but after she found out about the pregnancy, things got a bit complicated. Sarah started to hate Sarah, who then turned to Abraham for help in her part of the story. Neither RA became. Music. The terrible one gave her maid to you, and now that she's pregnant, she looks at me with disgust in her eyes. May the Lord judge between us. Abraham let Sarah do what she wanted, and so Sarah mistreated Hagar, who ran away a few years later. God forbid. The contract of the Holy One is to circumcise all men in his household, including his son Ishmael and slaves and servants. Abraham was 99 when he got circumcised and Ishmael was 13. Isaac, Sarah and Abraham's legitimate son, further intensified the tension between Sarah and Hagar. In fact, these conflicts started long before Ishmael arrived. It was in the desert that an angel of God appeared to Hagar and told her to go back to Abraham's house. There, the angel told her to name her. The son of Ishmael, who means God heard, was named that way because of Hagar's sickness, which God noticed in Genesis chapter 16 verse 11. But the conflict between Sarah and Hagar came to a head during Isaac's weaning. Sarah was so shocked that she asked Abraham to kick Hagar and Ishmael out. Even after God revealed that Sarah would have another son, Abraham still wanted Ishmael to be his heir. He said, Ishmael was born before you, in Genesis 17 verse 18. After Isaac was born, Abraham continued to love Ishmael, but Sarah saw him as a threat to her son's position. In those days, it was unusual for a servant's child to be kicked out, but Sarah's request seemed wrong. She wanted Ishmael gone. Abraham was hesitant though, and only acted because Sarah insisted. When he got direct guidance from God, it suggests that Sarah's reaction might not have been justified just by Ishmael's actions or even his presence. In the first verse of the 9th chapter of Genesis, it says Sarah saw that Ishmael, the son of Hagar, was being mocked. Does this mean Ishmael was mocking Isaac, or just playing with him? The word mockery can mean contempt or maybe just joy. For Sarah, Ishmael was a threat because he took away Isaac's place. The author of Genesis tells the story of Ishmael mostly to contrast him with Isaac. This contrast isn't about individuals so much as it's about fulfilling divine promises in an unusual way through natural processes. Although God preferred Isaac, Isaac corresponded to God's customs of choice, while the refusal of Hagar and Ishmael didn't. In the end, Hagar and her son had to face new challenges in the desert. They were sent there because Sarah didn't want her son to share the inheritance with Abraham's son, Isaac. This was a difficult situation for Abraham, but God told him to trust Sarah and follow her instructions. Through Isaac, Abraham would have great descendants, but he also promised to make a great nation out of Hagar's son. So Abraham got up early, packed some food and water, and sent Hagar and the boy on their way. They wandered through the desert, almost out of food and water. But then God heard their cries and provided them with water. Despite the hardships, God had a plan for Hagar and her son. He promised to bless them and make them into a great nation. Ishmael was trying to convince Hagar that he, as Abraham's son, would also be a great leader. 17:18. The fulfillment of this prophecy is recorded in Genesis, chapter 25, verses 2-8. They became leaders and formed the great nation of Ishmael. The Egyptians chose him as a wife, and he settled in the desert of Paran. Genesis 21. They lived in an area from Havi to Sur, east of Egypt, towards Assyria. Ishmael had 12 sons and a daughter, whose names are mentioned in Genesis, with numbers 2 to 15. Interestingly, Ishmael had a similar experience to his father, who also had 12 sons. This is comparable to the situation of Nahar, who had 12 sons, and Esau, who later had a daughter. Ishmael married the daughter of Esau, the son of Isaac, as indicated in Genesis 28 and 36. The area where Ishmael's descendants lived was located north of the Arabian Peninsula, in a desert between Ashur and Egypt. Isaiah 67 mentions the descendants of Ishmael, known as the Waphites. And Kid, as shepherds of the sheep, the descendants of Ishmael were called the Arabs. They were a warlike people, living in enmity with their relatives. So the prophecy came true that Ishmael would be like a wild man, raising his hand against all and all raising their hands against him. Later on, the Arabian Peninsula was inhabited by other tribes, like the descendants of Abraham's sons from Hay, the First Chronicles. There were also some descendants of Esau, like the Amalekites. Although Isaac was the only heir to the promise, Ishmael and the other sons of Abraham received material blessings from concubines in the second book of Genesis. This means that the children of Hagar and Isaac were also granted Abraham's property when they reached adulthood. The Bible doesn't say much about the disagreement between Ishmael and Isaac, but they both seem to have existed together. To bury Abraham, Genesis 25 verse 9 mentions a lot of names that are also mentioned in other passages as influential tribes. At that time, Ishmael, the son of Abraham, lived to be 137 years old. Although the Bible doesn't say where he was buried, Islamic tradition says his grave is at the Kaaba in Mecca. In the New Testament, Ishmael is mentioned by the Apostle Paul, who uses him as an example to contrast those who are free through Christ. The Bible also mentions other people, like Saul's descendants, Jonathan, a king's official, and a priest in Ezra's time. But the most famous one is Ishmael from the royal family of David. He killed Gedaliah, the ruler, during the Babylonian invasion of Judah. Overall, there are many interesting stories about Ishmael and other people from the time period. Although he wasn't the son of a promise, God took care of him and chose his name and promised him greatness beyond the Ishmaelite covenant. Ishmael had numerous offspring organized into 12 tribes, similar to Isaac's clan. God also said that Ishmael's descendants would live like nomads and face resistance. Over time, Ishmael's people intermarried with Midianites and Abraham's descendants through the Hittite tribe, forming a mixed group that led to the assimilation of Ishmaelian traditions. Today, many Arabs trace their ancestry back to Abraham, especially through Ishmael. There's a theory that Muslim Arabs are descended from Ishmael, and Muhammad was a supporter of this idea. He claimed he was a descendant of Ishmael and probably had some truth to that idea. Kenneth, a missionary and author, wrote about this topic. Fleming notes that there's a lot of evidence to support the idea that the Ismailis are a significant part of the Arab genetic heritage. Ancient texts show a connection between northern Arabs and Ishmael's descendants. It's likely that the whole population of the Arabian Peninsula is of Ishmaelian descent, since Hittites and Esau's sons also lived there. Although some modern Arabs can trace their roots back to Ishmael, not all Arabs have this lineage. The Muslim Bible tells us that God turned Ishmael into a powerful nation, and his descendants can receive Abraham's blessings by believing in Jesus for salvation. The story of Ishmael goes beyond his own life. It reveals aspects of God's work and grace in salvation. Ishmael represents the natural result of Abraham's union with Hagar, and Isaac represents that supernatural birth, when God allowed an older and barren woman to conceive a child. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul uses the story of Hagar and Sarah to teach an important spiritual truth about salvation. Hagar stands for the Old Covenant, based on human effort and obedience to the law. Sarah symbolizes the New Covenant, which is based on divine grace and the sacrifice that God offers. Paul compares believers in Christ to Sarah's son. We are free, born of the Spirit. We were once persecuted, like the natural children, but now we are spiritually transformed and dedicated to God's will. We are not servants, but heirs. We have been reborn and transformed. We belong to the new covenant, not the old. So, brothers and sisters, let's not be slaves to the past. Let's live in freedom, in God's grace, and in the will of the Father. So guys, this is a deep dive into the path of Ishmael. We're reminded of all the different experiences that the Bible has to offer us. We try to bring these stories to life with our reflections that span time and cultures. If Ishmael's story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and share this video with your friends. That way, you help us grow our community and spread the wisdom in these ancient tales. Thanks for being a part of the Bible Stories channel. Until next time, may the grace and wisdom of the Holy Scriptures guide your path. Subscribe, share, and stay tuned for more uplifting and inspiring stories.